Well, a lot of mistakes were made. A lot of things went into contributing this idea that the American Indians in the Western Hemisphere are all up and down. We're a bunch of savages running around in diapers, trying to figure out how to stay alive before the Europeans showed up to save them. Woo! Now, the disease in some cases decimated some of these nations, some of these states, some of these tribes, up to 95%. Now, the ones that got to 100%, they had help, of course, being annihilated. And there was a lot that some were 50%, 80%. But the diseases wasn't just one wave that came in. You can track all the years right from 15 right on. Every 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. You've got different patterns in different areas of the Americas, and you've got different diseases and different epidemics that came, just like you had epidemics going on in Europe. So you've got sometimes sometimes smallpox, sometimes plague, beriberi, malaria, mumps, measles. Any one of these might come in, and then they're recovering, and 15, 20 years later, a second one comes in. Malaria being the most insidious of all, because that stays. There's two types of malarias, but the number one that was really wreaked havoc in the Western Hemisphere for hundreds of years was a low-lying type of disease. It might strike and everyone would get sick, but it would then lie dormant in the bloodstream for 4 months, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, and you could have a whole state or a whole village of people that were struck with malaria, and over a period of many, many decades, it would be putting people down where they were ineffective for months at a time. So it was a very complicated disease, and they didn't have diseases figured out like the way we do today. They didn't know it was malaria. They didn't know what mumps and measles were. They had names for some of these things, but they were mostly guessing. It was the fevers. They had the shakes. They had the fevers. They had convulsions. That's what it would be described of when you looked at what the historians, people like Columbus, for example, what he described some of these things as. The fevers, they had the common types of fevers, and they would try to differentiate between them. So here's what happened in the Americas that we need to know about. We need to understand. That race of people that exists in so much diversity today and existed in so much diversity in the year 1492 and had existed in many types of diversities throughout the last 12, 15,000 years. They were a single race of people, one of the few races that we have on Earth today, but they were more homogeneous than any other race by far. In other words, when they look at the DNA and the immunization spectrum that these people had to ward off disease, they tended to come, as they may think, the old Bering Strait theory, that they came across the Bering Strait, which is under 140 feet of water today, that at some point it was not, and they walked across there. Of course, they also could have come across in boats and down the west coast of BC and come that way. But it is generally agreed upon that it's a single ethnic sort of people in a way that the other races of the world really are not. And this is provable by DNA, what we call the immunization spectrum. So in Europe, for example, the disease might hit, and if it's wiping out 10, 20, 30, 40%, that's pretty devastating, a lot of people getting killed. Because of the immunization spectrum of the American Indian, one person being more similar to the next person than anywhere else on Earth, they were much more susceptible to having a disease come and wipe them out to the tune of 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%. There's cases where it was 95%, and you only got 5% of the people there. So So that's one aspect of it, is the vulnerability that they had, in this area. And what a huge problem waiting to happen this was, when you consider what the Europeans and people from Africa were carrying and the vulnerability of the American Indian. Now, the other thing that we need to know nowadays is how quickly these diseases spread inland and how that affected our thinking. Now, there's been different mistakes made on reporting back to people in Europe what was going on in the Americas. One of the biggest ones, Holmberg's mistake, as Charles Mann calls it, was just in the last century, in 1940 to 42, living with some of these South American Indians and reporting back to Europe on what he found with these people. Seemed to be unable to make fire, carried it from village to village. Weren't able to have homes that could keep out insects and most of the elements and rain. Didn't seem to have a steady diet or a way of eating that was very organized. Their clothing really wasn't much to speak of. They didn't seem to be able to count very high. And on and on. He reported a number of these types of things and concluded that they were probably one of the most prehistoric people that had been found on Earth. Well, 20 years before that, they had a flourishing society. One that was built on a society that was 3,000 years old. And in that entire area of Bolivia, there's a whole civilization that they've discovered since then. And underneath that jungle landscape, which wipes things out in about 5 or 6 years, there is this remnants of this civilization. And they are said to be part of that. Anyway, 20 years before, they had been hit with a terrible disease, which knocked them down. So you've got about 5% of the people remaining. So all of your hunting, your farming, all of your knowledge gets totally destroyed. So this is one example, this Holmberg's mistake, of these reports coming back of him having lived with these people and not having any idea or any awareness of what was really happening with them historically. That we're talking about a 3,000-year-old history, then there's a 500-year-old history, then there's a 150-year-old history. In other words, the 500-year-old history is what they were doing around the time of the Incas and competing with the Incas. The 150-year-old history is that they had just moved into that area from somewhere else nearby. And then the 20-year-old history is what had happened to these flourishing villages just recently. And so he was coming in, reporting on this, living with them, witnessing it, not really aware of what was going on. Wrote a book about it, which was then spread throughout the world, not just in Europe, but all over the world. As I've stated many times, the Indians' image has been decimated worldwide, not just here, not just with the actual American Indians and the indigenous people themselves, mostly, yes, with Caucasians, but also among the Orientals, among the Arabs. Any city on earth you go to, the image of the American Indian has been destroyed. And this was the type of mistake that happened, this Holmberg's mistake, as it's referred to. So this information that he was disseminating, this would spread throughout scholarly treatises and reports and student activity, books, other books. It would be restated, and so compounds itself over and over. Anyway, these diseases spread inland before contact occurred. Now that has to enter your way of thinking about the reporting that was going on and our perception of these people. So the disease was not only wiping them out to a great degree, depending on what type of epidemic and when it happened, but it was spreading inland so quickly that by the time people were discovered, they were already in a state of having been wiped out by these diseases. Now, let alone the fact that many of them, the attempt was to try to conquer them and come in and wipe them out. So you've got problems with them. By the time you meet them, their farming's gone, their hunting is gone, they're just struggling just to hang in there. And they're starting to compete with the neighboring states and villages. And now some Europeans come in with differing states of trying to conquer them and wipe them out and take advantage of their resources, whether it be their labor, their manpower, their silver, their plants. And in many instances, yes, they were trying to flourish alongside of them and implementing the Indian to keep them alive as well too with their new colonies. But bottom line, reporting back to Europe again on what they found, which was in many cases villages that had previously already been hit by disease, because these diseases could move inland very quickly. So this is a repeating pattern that's seen all up and down the continents, and only very recently is realized that it clouds many of these pictures that we have of what happened in these areas. So it's another example. It would be funny if it wasn't tragic, right? As we know.